Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Harry Lausen series and my chess YouTube channel, grecochess. And we are continuing the series where we're presenting the game suggested to me by my Facebook friends. In the first video, my Facebook friend Keith Arkell suggested a game that he won against another British Grandmaster, Julian Hodgson. And in the second video, we had an Grandmaster from Azerbaijan, Rauf Mamedov, that suggested to me a game where he defeated a Russian Grandmaster, Danil Dubov. And in this third video, we once again have two British Grandmasters facing each other. My Facebook friend is James Plaskett, and he played against Tony Miles. The game took place in Lugano, Switzerland. The year was 1986. At that time, James Plaskett had a rating of 2435 versus 2610 for Tony Miles, and this meant that Tony Miles was a favorite. By now, 39 years later, if I'm correct, James Plaskett has a rating a little bit lower, 2335, while unfortunately Tony Miles died in the year 2001. I still remember that. It was a great tragedy for British chess and for chess in general. We're fortunate to have the notes of James Plaskett, and I'm going to read for the notes as the game unfolds. But let's first go to the chessboard. When I say the chessboard, of course, I mean the electronic chessboard that's provided by chess.com with the analysis. Once again, a reminder that you can see at the bottom the files from A until H, on the left the ranks from 1 until 8, and on the right part of the screen the computer analysis. What this means is if you see a plus sign, it means that white stands better, a minus sign means that black stands better, and computer says if that was the best move or not, and if not, which would have been the best move. And also what are the three best moves for the other player whose turn is to play. Since Plaskett had white and Tony Miles had black. In this game, unlike the previous one, we quite early leave the quote-unquote book, meaning the opening theory. We have the English opening for James Plaskett. And that's it. We finished with the quote-unquote book, the book move. You see, this is a figure of a book. This is the third move for white. Has a small advantage of roughly speaking 0.3. That is the advantage that white has. And usually white keeps the advantage so long as the players follow the opening theory, the quote-unquote book. But now Tony Miles is going to deviate from the book. He's going to send his pawn to g6. You see, this is the best move, but not a book move any longer. This is, the reason for that is the fianchetto, of course, to place the bishop on g7, even though temporarily this bishop will be blocked by the pawn on e5. Similar move for James. Pawn goes to g3. Bishop goes to g7 as expected. Bishop to g2. And knight goes to e7. White, it seems now that we're returning to the book. You may wonder how it happens. This may happen by what is called reordering the moves. I think the word is permutation or something like that. When you play the same moves as the opening theory, but not in the same order. Interpolation is the term, yes. That is why before we're not in book, but now we're again in book. Let's see how long we'll stay in the book. Pawn goes to d4 for white. Once again, we're leaving the book. Of course, the purpose of d4 is to control and occupy the center and attack the pawn at d5. The computer doesn't think it is the best, but it's not far from the best. Still a good move. Castling for black. Knight goes to e2. for white, and knight to d7 for black. Castling for white, and pawn goes to f5 for black. And now we're going to exchange on e5, both sides, the pawn on e5. And white, meaning James Plaskett, my Facebook friend, will place his pawn on b3. The reason why, of course, to give the option to the bishop to go to b2 for fianchetto. Black places the pawn on c6, 20 miles to control, of course, the square d5. But here, inaccuracy says the computers, that's why the advantage for James Plaskett reaches 0.75. And what white is going to do now, instead of placing the bishop on b2 to challenge the bishop on g7, goes to a3. You see here that the knight on e7 is attacked, and although it is defended by the queen, it cannot move, otherwise the rook is lost. White sends a pawn on f4. Yes, the black needs to play. We jump the move. The queen goes to e8. Now white sends a pawn to f4, and black sends it to e4. And white sends the queen to d6. You see that the knight is on e7 is attacked twice, both by the bishop and the queen. Defend once for now. That's why the rook has to go to f7, defend it. The rook from a1 goes to d1. White controls the d file. And the knight will go to f8. White starts taking more and more space. That's why the advantage increases, not too much. 0.72 is not an enormous advantage, but little by little, white is building. Rook goes to d2, possibly to put the rook at d1. Knight goes to e6. And white is going to place a bishop on h3. At this point, at least I'm switching the screen to read the notes of James Plaskett. What does he have to say? He says threatening a knight takes at e4. Yes, because if knight takes at e4, look at that. Bishop takes back, and then bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and queen takes bishop. And when everything is said and done, white has his extra pawn. That is white's idea. And black is going to move the pawn to g5. As I have mentioned before, white was not hoping that black would not see it and find no defense, but while black is defending, black cannot continue with any other plan. White g5, again, we have a note by James Plaskett, and he says that otherwise, if white takes the knight at e4, then the bishop goes to g4, and we have a double attack. Both the bishop and the knight are attacked. That's why the previous plan does not work. White will take the pawn at g5. And James says the fun begins. If instead white had placed the rook from d to d1, white would have kept it level and safe and done. So we're going on some fun. At least that's what James is saying, even though the computer says this is an inaccuracy. And now you see it is the other way around. If we have negative score, meaning black is ahead, minus 0.87. Now, once again, the pawn is in danger, the pawn f7. Not the f5, the pawn at e4 is in danger, because if knight takes it, if pawn takes back, then white takes the knight. For black to stop this idea, places the knight at g6, because now, if you look at the combination, knight takes pawn, pawn takes knight, bishop takes knight, Bishop takes bishop, and now queen cannot take bishop because there is a queen behind that is now free since the knight moved. Let's see the notes by James. James is saying that if instead black has moved the bishop at f8, instead of moving the knight, the combination of knight taking e4 would have worked. Writes a few more details about it, but this is the main point, that if knight had stayed here and bishop was here, then knight would have taken pawn. Bishop takes now at f5, because now the knight cannot take back. Only the rook can take back, but then the rook is lost. How does black reply? Black sends his bishop at f8 and attacks the white queen. And let's see where the queen can go, if anywhere. Nope, 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 nope. Of course, nope in this diagonal. Here not the knight, here not the knight. And the queen is lost. You may think that loss of the queen is very important and black should have an enormous advantage, but the computer only gives 0.24 advantage for black. Let's see what is going to happen. Of course, white, having lost, who is going to lose the queen, will try to take as much compensation as possible, starting with the pawn at e4. Bishop takes a d6. Knight takes a d6. So until now, white has won a bishop and a pawn, but attacks a queen. Let's see the notes of James Plaskett at this point. And what James is saying, where to move the lady, meaning the black queen. Queen d7 is worst after knight goes to d4. Queen to f8 allows various possibilities, starting with the knight taking to c8, queen at c8, and explains what is going to happen later. Now let's see if the computer of chess.com considers these possibilities. Yes, the computer considers them, but not exactly that way. Queen to d8 wants rook to d3. And not knight takes to c8. Queen to f8 is pawn to h4. No, sir. Queen to d7, let me restart. Queen to d7 is not even considered. Queen to d8 sends rook to d3. And queen to f8 sends the pawn at h4. But that's not the combination of James. James saying that queen to f8 will allow knight to c8, queen to c8, and knight to d4. Finally, what Tony did, Tony Miles, he places queen on d8. It's a mistake as a computer. And now the two players are at the same point. The difference is 0.00. Computer thinks from now on black has lost the advantage and the two players are even. But by placing the queen of d8, let's try to think, how did Tony think? White had a fork, could take queen or rook. The queen goes here, but now white cannot take the rook because queen takes rook. So by placing the queen at d8, deprived white of taking a fork. Now that black is a queen which white does not have, Black seems to be better. Not according to the computer, but that time, especially, this was 1986, without computers even outside the room, there was no way to think of it ahead of time. What does White play? White will place his rook on d3. You see now that the rook is protected by the bishop, so if White could play again, White could safely capture the rook without having to worry about his own rook. Black takes the bishop. Knight takes the bishop. Still, we are even. Players play their best moves. And queen will take a g5. James believes that Tony missed that rook taking to on f5 could be met by knight taking to f5, exactly like James played, when black should have taken the draw with queen takes to d3. So James believes that Tony had better at this point take the rook on d3. And this could lead to perpetual. Let's see what happened. Black took the pawn on g5, and the computer believes it's a miss. The computer also would like black to take the rook on d3. And now, really, the advantage for white becomes significant. 2.21 is quite significant. Here's black has the queen and two knights pointing to the white king, but the material difference starts being important. How did white reply? Sends the pawn to h4 and threaten the queen. Queen goes to h5. And James believes that Tony had missed his next move. James believes that Tony had better take the pawn at h4 instead of sending the queen on h5. And then James has tons of variation of what could happen if black had played knight takes on h4, then white would have taken on e7 with a check, and then move the pawn to e4. What is his conclusion? Black is up queen for rook and pawn, but has no adequate defense, believes James. And his combinations go all the way until move 36, almost 10 moves ahead. This if knight had taken on h4 instead of moving the queen to h5. And yes, the computer thinks that knight taking h4 would have been the best. How does white continue? Pawn goes to g4. Great move, says the computer, and also James himself gives 2 exclamation marks. The computer gives only 1 exclamation mark. James gives his move 2 exclamation marks. The queen is threatened, but the queen can easily take the pawn. White now is up by 4.02. Let's see what happens after black takes the pawn. The knight from e goes to g3. One of the knights has to go back, especially the e, because the e is under threat. If the king goes, for example, to h1 or h2, then the knight is lost. Now the two knights cover each other. Queen goes to h3. The black queen is dangerously near the white king. How will white defend? It's a case where computer says that white has 5.8 advantage. Material-wise, black has plus 3 points. During the game, the players could easily count the plus 3 for black. Might be suspicious that white is ahead, but had no way of knowing the computer analysis. Not only computers are not allowed in the game, but in 1986, these computers did not even exist. Knight goes to h6, check. King goes to g7. And here, White made a move that, in hindsight, James thought it was a mistake, a blunder. White moved his knight from h to f5, while you see here it is a miss. Both the computer James himself would rather have the other knight from g do the check. So at this point, James loses all his 5.39 advantage and goes down to 0. Players are even. And you see what's happening many times, even with the greatest players. Suddenly you may seem to be winning, but anything can happen and you can lose your advantage. King goes to f6. But this is a miss, and White retakes almost all of the advantage. Not 5 point something, but 4 point something, quite significant. Let's see what James says is his notes. This was the last arrow. That's all James says. King going to f6 was the last arrow, and it ended. And we'll see now the remaining moves. Knight goes to h5. It's a check. If the king had gone to f7, it would not have been a check. That's a big difference. And black would have time to, for example, check with the queen or do anything else. King goes to e5. Knight from f goes to g3. Great moves in the computer. Again, White's advantage is between 4 and 5. Knight from e goes to f8, basically one knight supporting the other. Bishop goes to b2, and you see now m4. At this point, computer says that White can mate in 4 moves, and let's see how. The first move is exactly what the computer suggests. Bishop goes to b2. And king goes to e6. This is exactly what the computer says. Knight goes to g7. King goes to e7. And bishop goes to a3 to check. Black has only one move to defend, and this is the pawn going to c5, but at that point, the bishop from a3 will go to c5 and checkmate. At this point, Tony Miles resigned, and James Plaskett had quite an unexpected move, given the fact that he was playing with an opponent that was 165 points, in fact, 175 points better than him. And let's see what the computer thinks in its review. We'll go through the game review. Well, the percentages are a little bit lower than the 90s we saw in the previous game. 88% for White, 73.5 for Black. You see here that White started creating a small advantage, then lost it, then created a huge advantage, and in one move, checking with the wrong knight, goes down to 0. But then the king going to the wrong square, f6 instead of f7, give White another advantage. And so you can see that these swings happen even at the grandmaster level, although not so frequently as in average players. Their performance: 2400 for James Plaskett, which is slightly less than his rating then. He was 2435. And for Tony Miles, it was quite low. Although his rating was 2610, it went down to 1750. Everyone can have their off game. And let's see how did the players do as far as moves are concerned. No, none of them had a brilliant move, but James had 5 great moves against one of Tony. 14 best for James versus 9 for Tony. Excellent 2 for James versus 3 for Tony. Good 2 versus 4. Book moves, 3 moves each of them. Well, after the third move of white, the third move of black was not a book, but later on black was able to have a move that sent them to a book position. That's why 3 each of them. Inaccuracies. 4 for white, 6 for black. Nobody made any mistakes, but they had 1 miss for white, 2 for black, and both of them had 1 blunder. This concludes the game that James Plaskett suggested against Tony Miles. It's quite an exciting game where white had his queen at loss, nowhere to save it, lost a queen, but went on to win the game, not because of a major mistake of black, but because white had seen that letting the queen be taken was at his best interest. And these are the most exciting games. We conclude now with this game of James Plaskett. There are more games to come. And just to tell you in advance, on September 7th, I'm participating in the Next Sanity tournament. I'll have games to show from there. And in the meantime, if there is the New York State Championship, if all goes okay, I plan to participate at that great event. This is Harry Lausanesiris, my Greco Chess YouTube channel. Thanks all of you for watching, for viewing, for subscribing, for liking, for positive comments. We'll be later with more videos from my Grandmaster friends. Ladies and gentlemen, goodbye.